Hello everybody, I think that's the start of our talk with the music going down. I'm Simon, it's good to be here. I've enjoyed some of the talks we've seen today so far.
I'm Kristy.
We work at Acquia and we've probably been doing this sort of work together probably about 6 or 7 years. So that's sort of where we're coming from in terms of the types of stuff that we do in our everyday work. We work in a part of the team that's called the support team for Acquia, and we're the first line of defence, I guess, where a site goes down, DDoSes are happening, code's been pushed that isn't working quite right. Our role is to actually go in and have a look at what's happening and then start giving some suggestions about where to head. So that's why we thought we'd do this talk and try to share some of those skills with you guys. Just out of interest, like how many people in the audience are actually developers? Did I just get everybody? Who's not a developer? What do you guys do?
Content administration.
Okay, yes, and...
Oh. Yeah, I'm a technical account.
Yes, I just realised who you were. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, so good. Most people are developers. There might be some extra stuff that's useful as well that helps you get insight into things, or you can take back to the team. Because a lot of this is actually about the concept of how do you approach these sorts of watermark issues where something goes downhill quickly.
Cool. Do you want to start?
Well, tell me about your journey to becoming a princess, Kristy.
Before I had a job at Acquia, I was a developer of sorts at a local agency in Brisbane, and a lot of my work was very varied. And I had a mentor who always used to tell me that I have my hand in too many pies, and that I looked at step 4 before looking at step 1. So eventually I decided, or I learned to first figure out what the problem was before going to step 4 and actually doing the first 3 steps first. And then that kind of got me to this role at Acquia, where that's what we do as well. So.
And I suppose my journey was sort of a little bit different. Like I used to run a group of websites, and things always seemed to go really smoothly. And so I thought I had all the skill sets needed to actually properly maintain and run about 14 websites. And until the day where a code push actually took down one of the websites. And I suddenly discovered I had this huge hole in my skills of what do I do now? Like what's our process when this goes down? Because it had never happened before. And I sort of in the back of my head, I knew what should be happening. But when it actually hits you for that first time, or it hits you at a really important point, sometimes you actually don't have those things in your head that you need to actually have set up beforehand. So that was a big learning experience for me many years ago now.
So why should you be a self-rescuing princess? So for the first part, having a different mindset can help you get a clear understanding on how to act when your site's down or when it's faulty. To be prepared means understanding how to get your site working again, and then also to discover what went wrong. And then the best action, once you've worked out what is important for your team, you can then know what action you need to take to make that happen again. And then the last point is also empowerment, getting your team together using a blameless approach. And then there you go. Oh, and you get to wear a tiara as well.
Yeah, so basically we're trying to say that when you're in developer mode, you have a sort of a certain hat on. But when you're actually in your rescue mode, you actually sort of have to drop a lot of what you would be naturally doing as developers and actually sort of maybe reprioritize or even do some pre-planning and actually talk to management or talk to other parts of your team. And we'll go into that in more detail as we go further into the slides.
So we have a question as well. If you, as an example scenario, if you've just pushed code to production and you're seeing a white screen of death, what are some things you would do first to identify why that's happening?
This is sort of like a check with you guys to see if what the rest of the things we're saying in the talk makes sense going forward. So what's the first thing you do?
Like deploy the previous commit that was stable.
Yep.
And then worry about what went wrong on the test site.
Yep. Okay, that sounds good. Would everybody just agree with that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I like it too. Yeah. So that's a really nice first thing, and that's part of what we're going to present today, of course. But there's other nice things you can actually build in around that as well that might be useful in certain situations. You can press the button. So, as we all know, change is the key to a problem happening. Like, things don't just magically occur. So we know that something's changed for your site, whether it's the traffic that's coming to your site, the type of traffic that's coming to your site. You might have the same numbers coming in, but where it's going to may change to some degree. The code you've just pushed in the commit. Values in a database, something's changed something somewhere. A new view's added that's suddenly opened up part of your site to Google bots and Slurp and Yahoo going into places where there's no caching done. You've updated a view. Sorry, I just said that one. So solving the problem is actually just partly and mostly about figuring out exactly what's changed. And once you actually have that point and understanding of exactly what's changed, so it's not always a code push, except in the last example, or where we asked you, it was clearly a code push. What about all the other times where your site goes down that isn't to do with you directly and isn't to do with something that's immediately obvious? Like, how do you approach those sort of situations? And it really comes down to change.
So there's some example questions. So these are sometimes the questions that we ask when we get a ticket from a customer that says their site's down. So we can ask them certain things like, if you have multiple sites, or multiple environments, is it happening on prod and not on dev and stage? A common example of that might be like file system. Sometimes we see issues with files disappearing, which tends to happen only on prod if you have multiple servers, whereas your dev and stage only have a single server. So that's one of the things we try to check for. Is it affecting anonymous users or just authenticated users? Is it just happening to one user? And then there's also what errors are you seeing? Where are you seeing them? Are you seeing on the site? Or is it a PHP error? Is it completely unreachable? And we'll run through some of this more in a later section.
Just on this, it's probably why we wanted to list a number of things. There's a lot more to that list. Like, we actually had to stop ourselves from putting things up. It's a big issue when you actually sort of see some changes happen and you don't know exactly where the problem is. Because you could ask a lot of questions. Is it how your stack is different between dev and stage and prod? But is it how the traffic's coming to production? So actually sort of figuring out part of the way of getting to that point of change that's actually important in this whole picture is having things in place so you can measure all of these things and easily find where the measures lead you. And part of this is sort of bringing your A game, is basically have your developer hat on for your developing, but also we want you to have, we're calling it SRP, self-rescuing princess hat, tiara if you like, on for the times where you actually have a big problem with your site. And it might not be a site down, it might just be an impairment of such, but most of the examples we're going to look around today are when the site actually goes down because of something, because they're often the times where you panic the most, or I would panic the most. And there's sort of very different modes in terms of when you have a developer hat on to a self-rescuing princess hat. Like, a developer hat would be including things like actually looking at problem solving particular issues where you actually know the whole realm of the issue. The ability to name things is a developer skill, like that's a really important skill. But a self-rescuing princess set of skills is actually focusing in a really different way. Like, a self-rescuing princess skills thinking environment is one of what's the most emergency important thing right now? Like, what do I have to do to make things better? It's not trying to figure out what went wrong. Like, sometimes you don't need to know what went wrong to make things good again. And so stepping away from that problem solving to one of actually sort of moving towards a solution quickly as a first step. So triaging is really important because, I mean, everybody's going to have very, very different sites that have very different requirements. So triaging is going to be very different for everybody in the room. And also sort of that confidence to step back quickly. And to get that confidence, because as a developer, I would want to know what was going wrong first and try to fix that as my solution to a site down. That would be my natural tendency, because I like fixing things. But Fixing would come later if you're sort of putting on a self-rescuing princess hat.
I was also going to add, it's a little bit harder to find out what a problem is once you've already resolved the issue. Sometimes we see issues where like restarting PHP will bring the site back, but when the site's back, you no longer can investigate what happened because it's no longer happening. So that's where you need to decide, do I want to figure out what the problem is? Has this issue occurred a few times in the last week or so? Therefore, you might be willing to make your site go down, or not go down, but have it down for a little bit longer so you have that time to investigate.
So this is like an example of how you might host a site, and this is probably multi-tiers in terms of it's got separate databases to the PHP servers. You could be behind a WAF or a CDN. Load balancers are sitting there. You're having to share a file system across maybe more than one web server. Like modern website hosting actually is a very complex set of affairs, and when you actually think about, developers pushing code onto the sites, users coming in, content editors coming in and doing things, maybe creating views and things, there's a lot of different places where a thing can go wrong. So I suppose when we say where can things, and drag, yes, I missed my line. I was supposed to say things don't magically happen. For example, dragons don't just magically appear in the middle of everywhere and blow things up, but in this case, yeah. Really bad timing. So this is where things can go wrong, basically here. Actually, there should be a here over there, and it's not there. So that's the PowerPoint slide going wrong. Kristy's going to hate me for mentioning this. This is a PowerPoint presentation, but I actually did it in an open office. And all of my heres were moving around the screen and doing amazing things, and we bring it to PowerPoint.
It just keeps crashing.
It just keeps on crashing. So, one for open office.
But there is one animation that worked.
Oh yeah? Oh yeah? Yeah?
No!
There you go.
Fire!
So we kept the fire.
And an additional here that did disappear.
Oh, that's where the here. Oh no, it's a different here. Okay. Anyway, let's forget that.
Okay, so your site's down. And there are two scenarios that we might need to consider, and both are about change. So we've got known change and we've got unknown change. So some examples of known change might be you did a code deployment. You've got traffic because of a campaign that you're running, or because of a load test that you're running. There could have been changes to the Drupal UI via a new view, or a module was enabled. User was deleted and all their content disappeared with that. A CDN was added or removed. There could be changes to the VCL, or a new external service was added.
And what's really important with known change is that somebody's going to feel suddenly very responsible, because they know they've just pressed that button, whatever the button is, and suddenly they're going, hey, that was me that made all of that disappear, or all of that change in a way that we can no longer use it. So you've got to, partly when you're doing your princess hat on, is actually sort of be prepared to deal with a person who's feeling sad, responsible, maybe that they're going to get blamed, and actually sort of try to get that out of the picture, and actually get it back to a place where let's just look at the actions that we need to get things back together again, so it's all working, and calm people down, and make it a smooth, calm process. We try never to, at Acquia, we always look at things with no blame view glasses on, so that we never point fingers at each other, unless it was Kristy's fault, and then it's never her fault.
Nobody found that funny.
Nobody found that funny. They don't know me. So unknown change is the other side of the coin, where it's actually a thing where I find it more exciting, because firstly nobody knows if they're to blame, so you could all feel responsible, or you might say, hey, it can't be me because I actually didn't do anything that made a difference, and this is something else that I can just look at with sort of a more analytical process. I suppose it's very different because it's also a harder situation, like in terms of when you first see that the site's gone down, your feeling about it's going to be, might be, where do I even start looking? So this is sort of leading us into the part of the princess process where you're actually prepared for any eventuality, and that your actual thinking is actually one of, these things will happen from time to time. Before they happen, I need to have a whole heap of things in place to be able to sort of know what to do at this sort of event.
And as an example of that, I had a ticket once. So our monitoring for Acquia detected there was an issue with a customer's website. And it turned out their site was completely down, white screen of death. After some investigation through New Relic, could see that there was a really big spike in external calls. And if I clicked on the transaction, I could then see that it was relating to a custom module that was pointing to an external service. That external service ended up being down. I tried contacting management, but they were not around. So then I made a call and decided if I disable this module, at least the site will be a little bit up, which might be better while I can't reach them than having a completely dead site that no one can reach. So then I disabled the particular module via Drush, and that brought the site back up. So there were a few things, or like I think the menus on the site relied on some of that external service, but at least people could then see that site again, instead of it just being completely white. So.
And that's a really, really good example of why we're going to start talking a little bit later on about actually knowing what your role is in the site down, as opposed to knowing what you can do to, well, you might know that there are things I can do that will actually help. So Kristy knew when she'd done some investigating, to stop this external call, which is taking up all the PHP processes, I'll just disable the module. And she did it with risk to herself, in that she was going, I can't talk to anybody, I think this is better. And that's a really terrible feeling for anybody to be feeling when they're sort of pressing the button to actually make things somewhat better. So for your own protection, I guess, we're going to talk later on about the idea of how do you involve the people before these things happen in a plan. Was that all?
Yeah.
Oh, the other thing we were saying, sometimes with unknown change, where you get the clue from is really important as well. Don't trust all clues that come in. For instance, if somebody rings in, and we've had a number of cases of this, people will ring into our hotline number and say, the site's down. And we get people on the team, can you go to the site? And we all see it as up. And it eventually sort of comes back to that the person where they're ringing from is actually having either an issue with their provider locally, like they're not, we say, can you just reach out to Google or some other place? So don't trust all information. Like, your site may not be down just because something's telling you it's down. There might be a problem with the monitoring service you're using, or the monitoring service might be too sensitive to a particular thing, or there might be a networking issue between where your monitoring service is and the actual website hosting. So always double check these things from a number of locations if you can. So this is sort of then leading on to the question of, for your safety, and how do you actually make sure that you're not doing the wrong thing? Like in Kristy's really good example, she took a risk to say, well, probably 9/10 of a site is better than 0/10 of a site. How do you know that it's more important to have the site up versus knowing that what went wrong with the site? There are actually some sites we host where they would actually rather know what was breaking the site on production quicker than actually having a site that was running, which totally amazes me when I sort of talk to some of the customers we have. But when they explain the reasoning behind it for their particular case, it's perfectly right. Is it worth having the site up versus losing some transactions in terms of shopping cart stuff? Like, how do you as developers actually make a decision that's correct for those types of situations? Like, where do you know where your boundaries are in terms of what you should be doing next? Is the best fallback going back to maintenance mode with a drush vset command to actually just put the site into maintenance mode? You can't really make that call by yourselves, I would suggest. I think this is actually something where you actually need to have some preparation with the management team. Like, actually identify clearly who is the real managers of the site. Like, who would be the person who actually signs off to say, this should happen in this process. And that might be a number of meetings that you actually have to have with management to actually explain to them, look, if we just back out of the change we've made, we might lose 10 or 20 or 30 transactions. How do you feel as management about losing those transactions? Because the site's been mostly available, it's just this bit that's not been working, but people could still be doing things on the site. Do you, as a group of developers, do you protect yourself with actually having management sign off on your boundaries in terms of these cases where you're pushing code?
I work saying the people who would be troubleshooting that sort of situation would know the
Okay.
Like some of our clients, if we have spurious transactions that might actually represent millions of dollars in mismatch between different systems. So you don't want it partially working. You
No.
want it all.
Yep.
Most of the clients, doesn't matter, it's pretty pictures.
Yep.
So if looking and get insights, great. So I think it's a bit of basic understanding of it. Then that covers some of that, but I reckon in large organisations you need to formalise that, right?
Yeah, I think so. And you'll know probably when you really want a real formal situation where millions of dollars are involved and things are properly signed off, as opposed to a site which is pictures. That's a really great example of where you might have a more relaxed approach. At Acquia, at one stage we would actually kill long-running select queries on the database server, where we saw that that was actually impairing the site. And then we realised that there is a certain way a select query actually might impact on how the database is actually structured. And suddenly we're going, okay, we're never going to kill select queries unless we actually tell the customer first, because it suddenly becomes risky for us, because we've suddenly realised there's this edge case that mostly won't happen, but could sometimes happen. And then customers started saying to us, but we sort of liked it when you were just killing the select queries that were going slowly, because that got our site back, and we really wanted our site back. So obviously we had customers who just wanted the pretty pictures up and running, and transactions weren't that important to them. So now we had to move to a process where we get customers sometimes actually tell us, look, if it's slow queries and the selects, just kill them. So it's getting that understanding with who you're working with is a really important point, and documenting it so that everybody knows it's clear and available for people to make those quick actions. Because killing a slow series of select statements is a really nice way of saving a site, and it can be really quick to resolve things.
And the same is for if we can't reach a customer because they're being DOSed or DDoSed, we also have a process in place where if we can't reach them, we're able to, on their behalf, do a hotfix in their HG access to block those IPs to get their site up. So that's another quick way that we can get a site up without explicit customer approval, which would say that in our, what do you call
Contracts.
it? Contracts, yes, thank you.
What did I just do then?
No, that's good. Oh, good.
That's just blank. Anyway, so basically your management's given you the go, no-go. Is everybody here set up with a like Git or Subversion? Does everybody use that sort of, does anybody not use it? Because I want to talk to you directly. No. Okay, so we're all good there. All right, okay. And the same with automations are really a good thing to have in terms of, if you are pushing code, are you automatically making sure that the database is backed up as part of your code pushing? Like, do you have mechanisms in place that actually automate things nicely for you? Because sometimes it's nice to not have to worry about, did we do a backup before we did this? Things can be left off if it's just on a checklist. So automation can be a friend of yours, but we also see cases where automation may be poor. For instance, there are some customers that will actually clear the varnish cache every time they push code. And on certain code pushes, that's just not going to be relevant to clear the varnish cache, depending on what you're doing with your deployment, or what's in the code deployment. Sometimes you don't need to clear much at all. Like, you can just push the code out and it's going to work because of what you're pushing out. So don't take automation to an extreme, is what I'm trying to say. Like, you might want to put some nice things into it that actually back up your database, and make a copy of it so that if something goes wrong, you have that point in time where you can go back to. But don't just put everything that you could think might be useful into it, because we see sites go down with varnish being cleared and the Drupal cache being cleared, and even mem cache being cleared from the servers. And then there's no caching at all there for the site after the code push has gone out. And then when you actually look at the code push, you think, well, it probably wasn't necessary in this particular case to do that much removal of cache. So have that balanced view. When you push code, consider your automation as part of the code push, so that you include and remove the things that are actually relevant for that particular point in time that you're pushing the code. It's just going to be blank, isn't it? Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Is this an example of white screen
This is
Yes.
this is what Drupal looks like when storage fills in the database server.
Cool. So princesses have friends. Make sure that you do talk to people in your team and let them know that the site's down. There may be someone who can help or someone who can tell you, oh yeah, we're running a campaign. Or if there's a load test going on. And also just remember that taking a step back can sometimes be very helpful. As an example, there was once where I spent 3 hours working on a problem with PHP code, and there was also a white screen of death. Couldn't work out what was happening. I checked everything, loops, just couldn't work out what it was. And then I, after a few hours, asked someone, can you just have a look at this, because I'm not sure. It ended up being a blank line at the end of the PHP file that I spent 3 hours on, but that could have been solved a little bit quicker if I had have just asked for help sooner.
And maybe with talking about friends, like we were chatting upstairs about the idea of, like, are there many individual devs here, or are you all in teams, like individual devs? Do you actually have friends who you can actually reach out to and actually sort of brainstorm issues?
I've had to make them like
Yeah.
purposefully.
Yeah, that's such a good thing to do. Get into your Drupal groups if you have a local Drupal group, but actually having that ability just to talk about the issue, because sometimes there's actually not the actual sharing of the information to the person that makes a difference. Actually, once you say it, you actually give yourself the answer, and that's the other thing, is you can have a little doll to talk to. And is it a rubber duck, a yellow rubber duck that's used in the example where they say, just talk to your duck and explain it as if explaining it to a friend?
Can't take people like judged enough for
Yes.
behaviour.
You could just do it privately. Yeah. So the idea is actually sort of having, if you can, that group around you to actually look at things. I mean, sometimes you could just look in, there's a space there. Like, it's that quick to see that sort of issue. Whereas other times, you may never see that space for some reason because you're thinking there's a problem with the code. And so where your focus is really helpful to have other focuses come in. And we do it all the time in our team. We have people around the world that we sort of reach out to, because sharing an idea and a problem is one of the nicest ways of actually learning about how Drupal works as well, and sort of learning better ways of doing things. I was just reading what was just there. You can't see this because we've got it in notes.
We talked about that.
Oh, we already talked about that.
That was my blank line.
Yeah, blank line thing, yeah.
Cool.
So, the other thing that's really helpful is, if you don't have friends, is you can also have systems and services in place that actually are really useful. So, I love logs. Does anybody love logs? Like actually going into them and pulling them apart and sort of making tables out of them. Like, logs are the most amazing thing in the world, but not everybody likes actually making sort of lines of grep, awk, sed, whatever, to make pretty results on your screen. Luckily, there are services for this, like Sumo Logic. Who's heard of Sumo Logic or some other logging type saving space? Okay, Sumo Logic is a brilliant thing. It's not cheap, but there are tools that actually really help you to control your logs and understand what's actually happening within them. And if you're going and doing dev work for say a site that has PCI compliance, who does PCI compliant sites? Not too many. Okay, because I hate PCI compliance. I used to sort of do it in the past. So credit cards are really tricky in some ways because they actually give onerous demands on you to store logs. You have to keep them for 2 years. So how do you safely keep 2 years worth of logs for your, say your access log from Apache? There are services where you can actually just send the logs off to that are accredited, like Sumo Logic. And they'll store and keep those logs in a safe place. So if your servers burn down, or if they're on the cloud and you've got like 5 web servers, but one web server goes down, you still generally, or you could lose the logs from that particular web server. With Sumo Logic, those things are basically off in a flow all the time. The really strong thing about some of these products out there, like Sumo Logic, is, and I don't work at Sumo Logic, I have no shares in it whatsoever, but it saves our bacon quite often because we actually start to see very easily certain trends that are happening for sites that we don't have to do much coding or much grepping through log files to see. So as a tool, just be really aware that there are other things out there that you can use that make some parts of your job really easy. And if you're going with some customers that PCI compliant requirements, and they're hosting in a way that you can't guarantee the log files will be always available, start looking at adding in sort of things where you actually meet compliance and also make your life easier as a dev. Do you want to talk about modules? Was that-
So if you don't have friends, there is the Drupal issue queue that might be
yes.
able to help you out. And as another example, I've seen a few tickets in the past where URL aliases aren't updating, and there's a known issue with the latest version of the Path Auto module that states if you've already created a content type and not assigned it an automatic alias, and you then change that alias, it doesn't reflect on the existing nodes. So a really quick way of figuring out if this is a problem is by going to the issue queue and saying, is this an issue for my module? And then also, is there an update to this module that may have fixed this problem?
Can I ask the team here, who actually blames themselves first for anything that goes wrong with the site and then looks at Drupal.org for maybe it's been fixed by somebody because they broke it earlier? Yeah, it's just a really good click. For the people who don't look straight to Drupal.org as a source, please start doing it, because it really is a good thing to double check that it's probably not your fault, say 62% of the time.
And another thing to add as well is it's also important to recognize patterns if something has happened in the past. So I guess because at Acquia we see a lot of issues, we get to see, oh, this has happened before. Another example of that might be the first time I saw MySQL server has gone away error. I didn't quite know why that was happening, and now in most cases it is because the file storage on the database volume is full, therefore MySQL can't run anymore. So now when I see a ticket like that coming in, that's the first thing that I check for. So it's a good thing to keep in mind that there are patterns in these kind of things that can help you to uncover a problem in the future.
And this sort of goes back to sort of the idea of actually having the information at hand. We said earlier on at the very start of the talk almost, it's really important to have those bits and pieces of knowledge about what's happening on the servers available to you. So actually watching, especially storage from MySQL, is hugely important. So you've got two approaches to it. Like, one is you could write a little something or other that sends you email saying storage is at this much, or a df-h to sort of see all your site storage, and just sending it to yourself. Or you could be using a service that might look at that particular part of the storage of where you are. Because you know that if MySQL storage fills, the site just stops. Like, it really does do a white screen of death and doesn't move forward. I mean, the other way you could approach that sort of situation is you could actually sort of give twice as much or 3 times as much storage space, because storage is cheap. So why not way over provision certain parts of your sites or of your service stack, so that you're never going to run into the issue of MySQL fiddling its storage.
Cool. So to conclude, the mindset for being a self-rescuing princess is to be prepared for change, measure what needs to be measured, and know where change has happened. Sometimes the direction forward is taking a step back. It also really helps to actually clearly identify what the problem is. Anything else to add?
Well, can you hear the alarms? If you set up monitoring, make sure you're available for that monitoring to be able to ping you. Actually, I suppose the question that is also in the back of my head is, as developers, are you expected to be fixing a site that's gone down? Or are you who actually is working for a company where you're the person that's responsible for the website in every 24 hours of the day? Is there anybody in that sort of situation? So do you have alarm situations where, do you have access to sort of information all the time to tell you that your server stack's doing the right thing from your perspective? Yeah, sometimes it's probably one of the easier things to set up in some ways, depending on where you have the stack. But it's probably one of the most useful and quickest tools of actually being alerted to an issue if you set up that sort of feedback.
I think that's it.
Is that it? Questions? Yeah. Yes, I knew there was going to be a question section. Yes.
A couple of things that got Stony mentioned.
Yes.
But I was curious to mention things that I've learned.
Yes.
Today
Yep.
Is know the whole stack,
Yes.
and that includes opcache. And
Yes.
That includes memcache.
Yes.
Because a lot of the time I go, this is all nothing's everything should work. This is exactly the same apart from
Yes.
what might happen when something's looking for something which isn't in the opcache because it hasn't been resolved.
Yeah.
It hasn't been cached here at all.
Yep.
Troubleshooting, do you know what the whole stack is? And what was the other one? Like when your test site is subtly different from your production site,
Yep.
it's like one of the classics.
Yeah. I mean, you can have different memory settings on your test environment to your production environment. And also with APCU, I do see quite a few D8 sites where APCU's sort of bumping its limits. So that can do some subtle things to slow the site right down. So that's like an op cache, APCU cache issue. And the other thing that I thought was interesting, I've seen memcache fill on occasions, which is normally you would say is not a bad problem. It's just, it'll slow the site down, but it won't stop a site. But I've seen that then impact on opcache and have a weird thing where opcache suddenly breaks and actually took a clearing, and probably 3 times in 4 years. So not very often, but yeah, had to clear both opcache and memcache to actually get the site to work forwards.
Sometimes memcache is just wrong.
Mm.
And it's rare, but sometimes like, no, that is not what the database is.
Yeah.
Diluted.
Yeah.
Go away.
And sorry, just talking about memcaches is one of my favourite things. When you move something, say your locking mechanisms into memcache for speed, so you put something in your settings.php and you have your locking mechanisms there. If that database still has the
Yeah. I hope there were no other questions, because
make sure you truncate your tables if you move a table into memcache. It's just what I want to say, because if you lose memcache, you're suddenly going back to a very old data in your database table. And that's it. That's what.
I just have one more thing to add. I was going to say we were going to make a document with some of these things, especially because we didn't really talk about tooling, because I think talking about one tool probably would have taken him an hour. So we were going to make that document, put it on the DrupalSouth website. If you have any things that you want us to add to that, just let us know, and then we can put that in.
But all the questions we ask are going to be in it. So yeah,
Yeah.
are in the slide.
Okay, that's it.